Do I need ID or just the right skin color? Michelle Obama held her ground, meeting the officer's stares with unshaken poise. The weight of their doubt wasn't new. It was a story told in every suspicious glance, every unnecessary question, every assumption that her presence needed validation. "I'm here to mentor young girls," she repeated, her voice steady. One officer shifted uncomfortably. The other remained rigid. "Just a routine check," he insisted. Before Michelle could respond, a voice interrupted. A young girl, wide-eyed with recognition, ran up. "Mrs. Obama!" she beamed. The officers stiffened. Realization hit like a tidal wave. "Have you ever been judged before even speaking? How did you handle it? Drop your thoughts below, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from." The suburban neighborhood Michelle Obama arrived in was the epitome of tranquility. Lush green trees lined the streets, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, casting dappled shadows on the sidewalk. The homes, each with their perfectly manicured lawns, reflected an image of peaceful, family-friendly bliss. Flowers bloomed in vibrant colors along white picket fences, and children's laughter echoed in the distance. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved as they walked their dogs, where life seemed to follow the rhythm of comfort and predictability. Yet beneath this picturesque exterior, something else lingered, an undercurrent of suspicion and bias waiting to surface. Michelle's car hummed softly as she navigated the winding road, taking in the serene surroundings. She had come to this quiet place to meet with a group of young girls, a mentoring session she'd been looking forward to. It was supposed to be a moment of connection, of sharing her journey, of giving back to the next generation. She'd planned everything carefully, wearing a simple cardigan and jeans, hoping to blend in, to be just another face among the many who lived here. But as soon as her feet hit the pavement, things began to shift. The soft hum of the neighborhood with its lawns and flowers contrasted sharply with the sudden, sharp presence of the two officers. Their approach felt like a stark interruption to the peace that had defined this place moments ago. What should have been a quiet, meaningful visit was quickly becoming something much darker, a reminder that no place was truly safe from the biases lurking beneath the surface. As Michelle Obama stepped out of her car, there was something unmistakable in the way she moved. She exuded a quiet grace, a woman at ease with herself and the world around her. Her movements were deliberate, purposeful, but also unhurried. Her posture was upright, as if she carried the weight of her experiences, but it was a weight she wore proudly, never allowing it to diminish her warmth or approachability. She didn't need the trappings of power to announce her presence. It was evident in the way she held herself. The soft morning light brushed her features as she stepped onto the quiet suburban street, her eyes briefly scanning the surroundings. A smile spread across her face, a smile that was genuine and full of reassurance, the kind that immediately put anyone at ease. It wasn't just a smile. It was a reflection of her belief in the power of connection. This wasn't about her. It was about the people she was here for. There was no air of arrogance, no pretense. She wasn't here for the fanfare or the attention. That often followed her. Dressed simply in a soft cardigan and worn jeans, Michelle blended seamlessly into the neighborhood. She looked like any other woman on her way to a local event. No polished suit, no heels, just a pair of comfortable shoes and an aura of confidence that didn't need to be broadcasted with labels or titles. In this moment, Michelle Obama wasn't the former First Lady, the global icon, or the revered public figure. She was simply a woman who believed in the power of showing up and making a difference in the most authentic way possible. Her mission for the day was clear, and it wasn't about speeches or grand gestures. There were no cameras here, no crowds of people clamoring for her attention. This wasn't a high-profile conference or a public event filled with politicians and influencers. Today, Michelle was there for the young black girls she had come to mentor, a group of bright-eyed, eager individuals who looked up to her, not for her celebrity, but for her story. The story of overcoming barriers, navigating a world that wasn't always welcoming, and rising above it all with resilience. These girls, many of them from neighborhoods not unlike the one Michelle stood in now, were here to hear about the power of persistence, the strength found in one's own identity, and the belief that greatness could come from anyone, no matter where they started in life. As she walked toward the small community center, Michelle's mind shifted from the public-facing role she often played to the intimate, personal purpose she had come here for. This wasn't about recognition or prestige. It was about connection. It was about giving something of herself to a generation that was still fighting their own battles, many of them battles that Michelle herself had fought in years past. And here, in this moment, there was no need for accolades. There was only the work, the kind of work that didn't require validation from the world, but rather from the lives she could touch directly. Michelle had spent years in the public eye, using her platform to fight for causes close to her heart: social justice, education, equality, and uplifting those who had been forgotten or dismissed. But despite all of her accolades, despite the millions of people who admired her, Michelle knew that the true impact of her work had always been in the quieter, more personal moments. It wasn't about grand speeches or global campaigns. The real change came from the smaller, more intimate connections, the quiet moments spent with young people, showing them they mattered, teaching them how to stand strong and pursue their dreams, no matter how many doors were closed in their faces. This wasn't her first time mentoring, and it certainly wouldn't be her last. Over the years, Michelle had met so many young women, black girls, just like the ones she was about to meet today, who had never been told they could be more, who had been told they were too loud, too bold, too different. She had been there, in their shoes, feeling like an outsider, wondering if her voice would ever be heard. But Michelle knew that her story, her journey from a working-class girl in Chicago to the White House, could offer something far more valuable than advice or direction. It could offer hope. Hope that no matter what the world said about them, they could rise above it, redefine the narrative, and build a future of their own making. But there, in that small suburban neighborhood, none of the worldly titles and recognition she had earned through years of public service mattered. In that moment, Michelle wasn't defined by her past roles, nor was she defined by the expectations others placed on her. She was simply a woman showing up for the people who needed her, the people she felt a deep, unbreakable connection to. These girls didn't need to hear more about her accomplishments. They needed to see that she, too, had struggled. They needed to know that despite her success, she was still just like them in so many ways. And that was the gift Michelle was giving them today, the gift of seeing themselves in someone who had gone before them and, against all odds, made it through. In the coming hours, Michelle would speak to these girls, share her experiences, and help them see the possibilities before them. But more than that, she would offer something even more profound: her presence. She was there, not because she had to be, but because she knew that showing up for others, no matter how small the setting, could change lives. This was her calling, not the spotlight, not the recognition, but the quiet work of making a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. As Michelle walked toward the entrance of the community center, she noticed the officers standing, a few paces down the street. At first, their presence seemed harmless enough, two uniformed figures keeping an eye on the area, part of the usual patrol. But something about their stance caught her attention. They weren't just standing idle. Their eyes were fixed on her, a scrutiny that felt uncomfortable. Officer Davis was the first to approach. He was tall, with a solid build, his hand resting just above his holster. His face, though calm, seemed distant, as though he were judging. her presence from a place far removed from the peaceful neighborhood around them. He took a step toward her, his body language subtly defensive, as if preparing for a confrontation that hadn't yet materialized. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his tone polite but overly formal. "May I ask what brings you here today?" Michelle, used to being questioned by strangers, offered a polite smile. "I'm here for a mentoring event with some young girls." Her voice was steady, but inside something in her stirred. Officer Jenkins, a shorter man with a stern expression, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, not quite making eye contact. His stance was subtly aggressive, arms crossed in, a way that spoke more of suspicion than professionalism. "Is this a regular event?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge. "Seems a little out of place for someone like you." The words hung in the air, like an accusation veiled in curiosity. Michelle's smile faltered just a fraction, but she quickly regained her composure. The questioning wasn't just routine, it was calculated, designed to make her justify her presence in a space that clearly didn't seem to expect her. As Michelle stood facing the officers, the tension between them palpable, a young girl in the distance watched from behind a tree. Brianna, one of the girls Michelle was here to mentor, had been eagerly waiting for her arrival. She was about 12, wide-eyed with admiration for the woman she'd seen speak at rallies and in interviews. To Brianna, Michelle wasn't just a mentor. She was a symbol of strength, resilience, and the possibility of a better future. Brianna had seen Michelle on TV countless times, but this moment, right here, was going to be special. She'd been waiting all morning to meet her hero, to hear her talk about overcoming obstacles and the importance of education. But now, standing just a few feet away, Brianna's excitement began to fade into confusion and unease. She watched as Michelle calmly answered the officer's questions, but the growing tension was evident even to Brianna. The two police officers weren't acting like they were simply checking for something out of place. They were questioning Michelle's very right to be there. Brianna's stomach twisted. She wanted to step forward, to say something, but fear held her back. Meanwhile, a bystander standing just across the street had started filming. He was an older man, graying hair and a baseball cap perched on his head, holding his phone up to capture the interaction. He wasn't alone in noticing the strange dynamic unfolding. As the video recorded, he shook his head, his voice barely audible but filled with disbelief. "Why are they harassing her? This doesn't make sense." His questioning gaze toward the officers grew more pointed. Something about the injustice happening before him stirred something in his chest. He couldn't remain silent. "Have you ever been judged unfairly for just trying to do something good? How did you handle it?" Michelle took a deep breath, willing herself to remain calm. The officer's questions, although not directly threatening, carried an unmistakable undertone. "You're here to speak to some girls, you said," Officer Davis repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly as though searching for any sign of dishonesty. "And you're sure you're supposed to be in this neighborhood?" She could feel the weight of his words, each one laced with skepticism. "Yes, I'm here for a community mentoring event," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with an edge of frustration. She had explained herself clearly, yet the questioning seemed to grow more invasive with each passing moment. "Officer." Jenkins stepped forward, his stance more aggressive now, as though he were challenging her rather than simply trying to clarify the situation. "You didn't think to bring identification? You just showed up here like this, no credentials?" he asked, his tone more pointed. Michelle could feel the subtle shift in the air, the tension rising as the officer's questions took on a more accusatory nature. She knew these were the kind of questions no one would ask a white woman in the same position, especially not one of her stature. The injustice of it gnawed at her, but she kept her voice composed. I don't typically carry a badge or ID when I'm meeting with young people, she said, her voice firm but calm. But I'd be happy to provide any details you need. The officers exchanged a glance, their lack of acknowledgement growing more pronounced. I'm sure you would, Officer Davis muttered under his breath, his words just loud enough for Michelle to hear. The subtle malice in his voice was unmistakable. They were no longer asking to understand. They were questioning her presence in a place they clearly didn't expect her to be. Michelle's patience was wearing thin, but she knew that any hint of aggression on her part would only fuel their assumptions. She smiled tightly, feeling the sting of their prejudices weighing heavily on her shoulders. Michelle stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She had faced prejudice before, plenty of times in fact. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, she'd learned early that the world often saw her not for who she was, but for the color of her skin. There had been moments in her life, even as First Lady, where she had been dismissed, overlooked, and judged for no other reason than her blackness. Yet each of those moments had built her resilience. Each had taught her how to fight in ways that were graceful and strategic. But this was different. The officer's subtle accusations stung, digging deeper into the years of experiences that Michelle had carefully managed and compartmentalized. The judgment wasn't just based on her identity, it was based on an assumption that she didn't belong, that a black woman, especially one like her, could not simply be in a peaceful, predominantly white neighborhood, trying to make a difference. She wanted to snap back, to ask them if they'd ever questioned a white woman in this way, to tell them how many times she'd been underestimated, overlooked, simply because of her skin. But she couldn't. Not here, not with these officers who had already made up their minds. Her heart pounded in her chest, but Michelle reminded herself to breathe. She had spent years teaching herself the power of calm in the face of chaos, and now was no different. This was bigger than her own frustration. It was about setting an example, not just for the girls she was here to mentor, but for every black person who had ever faced this same kind of dehumanization. But even as she took a deep breath and pressed on with her composed answers, she felt a rising anger bubbling under the surface. The unfairness of it all, the way they assumed her presence, was a threat, a mistake, something to be scrutinized and doubted, was hard to swallow. Yet she couldn't let them see that. Her thoughts flashed back to her childhood, to her father, who had taught her that resilience was not just about enduring hardship. It was about rising above, turning the other cheek when necessary, and using one's voice to fight without being consumed by rage. As Michelle continued to stand there, her nerves steadied, but a growing sense of unease settled deep in her chest. She had been calm, too calm, almost. She knew the officers were, testing her, pushing her into a corner to see if she would falter, but this wasn't just about her anymore. The situation was escalating, and she could feel it. The officers exchanged brief words, one of them pulling out a radio. "Backup," Officer Jenkins said, his voice low but steady as he spoke into the device. Michelle's stomach twisted. The decision to call for backup wasn't casual. It was a deliberate act to intensify the situation, to escalate her presence into something threatening. She stood there, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't just about an innocent encounter gone wrong. It was about the larger pattern, the systemic bias that so often painted black people, especially black women, as suspicious by default. Michelle's mind flashed through the countless moments when people had treated her as less than because of her race. But this felt different. The first wave of bystanders began to gather, some clearly curious, others hesitant. Some people looked on with concern, but most merely watched in silence, as though waiting for something to happen. A few took out their phones, perhaps to record, but none approached to speak up. Michelle could sense the eyes on her, the judgment, the indecision in the air. She had grown accustomed to being watched. She'd been the subject of public scrutiny for years. But now, it felt different. This wasn't the glare of the media or a room full of people waiting for her to speak. This was more insidious, more isolating. There was no support from those standing nearby, only an eerie indifference, as though they too believed she didn't quite belong in this space. She had always been an advocate for community, for standing together against injustice. But today, the weight of the silence from those around her made her feel as if she was standing alone, fighting not just against the officers, but against a society that often turned its back when the fight seemed too difficult. The harsh words from the officers, the growing sense of abandonment from the bystanders, and the swelling feeling of isolation began to push against her calm. But she couldn't afford to break. Not here. Not now. Brianna had been standing in the shadows, watching the scene unfold in front of her, her heart pounding in her chest. The excitement she had felt moments ago at the thought of meeting Michelle Obama in person had long since evaporated, replaced by confusion and a deep, unsettling feeling. She had always admired Michelle for her strength, her ability to rise above the challenges she faced, but now she was witnessing something entirely different. Brianna was witnessing injustice up close, something that made her stomach churn. At first, she didn't know what to do. Should she approach? Should she say something? She watched as the officers' questions became more pointed, more accusatory, and the tension between Michelle and the police continued to escalate. The words they spoke to Michelle seemed less about gathering information and more about imposing their power over her. Brianna's throat tightened as she tried to understand how something so unjust could happen to someone as accomplished as Michelle. Without thinking, Brianna pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed out a message to her group of friends. "You won't believe what's happening. Michelle Obama is being stopped by the police for no reason. It's crazy." She hesitated for a moment before hitting send, unsure if it was the right thing to do, but something inside her told her that staying silent was not an option. Meanwhile, across the street, the older man who had been silently observing pulled out his phone. He had seen enough. Without another word, he began recording the interaction, his thumb moving quickly to hit the live stream button. The feed started rolling, broadcasting the unfolding event to anyone who happened to be watching. The man's voice, though quiet at first, grew louder as he questioned the officers. "What's going on here? Why are you treating her this way?" His voice cracked with disbelief, a stark contrast to the cold indifference of the officers. "She's not doing anything wrong. She's just trying to help the community." As the video began to spread, the dynamic shifted. The bystanders' live stream captured Michelle's calm, dignified stance, highlighting the injustice of the situation. Brianna's text reached her friends, who immediately began sharing the information. The ripple effect had started. The weight of the silence from the other bystanders began to lift, and a sense of hope started to replace it. Michelle felt the change too. It was subtle, but unmistakable, the shift from isolation to solidarity. People were starting to notice. They were beginning to question the situation. And perhaps, just perhaps, this moment wouldn't end with her being silenced. The air had shifted. What began as an uncomfortable encounter was now taking on an undeniable edge. Michelle could feel the officer's frustration rising with every word she spoke. She had already explained herself calmly, remained composed, but their questioning wasn't about understanding anymore. It was about control, about forcing her to submit, to bend under the weight of their assumptions. Officer Jenkins took a step closer, his face tightening into an expression of barely contained anger. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clipped, "we've been patient with you, but your lack of cooperation is becoming an issue." His words were a thinly veiled threat, his hands now resting too firmly on his belt. "We're going to have to Detain you if you continue to refuse to provide proper identification. Michelle's chest tightened at the word detain. She had seen it too many times in the news, heard too many stories about people who had been detained or arrested under similar circumstances. Her mind raced with possibilities, but her face remained calm, stoic even. She couldn't afford to show fear. Not now. Not when she was standing here, in front of the young girl she had promised to help. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," Michelle replied, her voice steady, "but I will not let you treat me like I don't belong here. I've told you who I am, and I've told you why I'm here. There's no need for this." Her words were measured, each one deliberate as she held her ground. She could see the tension in the officer's body language now, coiled tight, ready to snap. Officer Davis took a step toward her, his hand hovering near his radio. "You don't get to tell us what's necessary," he snapped. "If you don't want to cooperate, we'll have to escalate this." His eyes flashed with a growing impatience. The moment of civility had passed, and now it was clear Michelle was being treated like a problem to be solved, not a person to be respected. A chill ran through Michelle's spine. She had felt that cold disregard before, when people saw her, not as Michelle Obama, but as a black woman who needed to be controlled. She could feel her pulse quickening, but she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that responding with anger wouldn't solve anything. It would only feed into their narrative. The officer's hostility was no longer hidden. The threat to detain her was real. Michelle felt a rising wave of fear, not just for herself, but for all the black individuals who had been wrongly detained, wrongly accused. Have you ever witnessed someone in a situation like this? Did you speak up or stay? Silent? Share your story in the comments. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. Michelle could feel the weight of the officer's scrutiny pressing down on her, suffocating her every movement. But inside, something was shifting. The quiet, simmering anger she had kept contained was rising, tempered by the calm resolve she had worked years to cultivate. She had been patient. She had remained composed, even when every fiber of her being wanted to shout, to fight back. But now the line had been crossed. "You don't have the right to treat me like this," Michelle said, her voice steady but unwavering. She could feel the presence of the bystanders behind her, some filming, some just watching. They were waiting for her to crumble, waiting to see how she would respond to the cruelty of this moment. But Michelle Obama wasn't here to bow to anyone's assumptions. She wasn't here to apologize for existing in a world that still saw her as an exception, an anomaly, a curiosity. She was here to make a difference, and that difference wasn't going to be made by shrinking into herself. She wasn't going to be silenced. "Listen, I understand that your job is to ensure safety, but I'm not the threat here," she continued, her voice clear and firm. "I'm not the one causing harm. I'm here to help. You don't have the right to make me justify my presence in this community." Her words were calm, but they carried the weight of years of experience, of navigating a world that constantly expected her to prove her worth. The officers faltered, momentarily thrown by her assertiveness. Michelle could see their hesitation, and it only emboldened her. She was standing up for herself, but more than that, she was standing up for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. She refused to let their assumptions define her, define anyone. "You're right," Michelle continued, her gaze unwavering. "I don't owe you an explanation. I don't owe you anything." It was in that moment, when Michelle spoke her truth, that something inside the officers shifted. Their frustration had been replaced by uncertainty, the calm in her voice a stark contrast to the hostility that had once defined their approach. Michelle felt the ground beneath her feet solidify. She wasn't just defending herself, she was shifting the power dynamic, and in doing so, she had taken control of the narrative. The moment that had seemed destined for confrontation was now on the verge of transformation. The live stream now picking up momentum, spread across social media like wildfire. What began as a quiet video had quickly gained the attention of hundreds, then thousands, who tuned in to witness the growing confrontation. Comments flooded in, most of them in shock, others in full support of Michelle's calm yet powerful defiance. As the video circulated, more people gathered in the street, drawn by the buzz of the incident and the clear injustice unfolding before them. A few moments ago, Michelle had felt like she was standing alone in the face of something far larger than her, but now that silence was giving way to voices of support. A man in the crowd shouted, his voice rising above the murmur, "This is wrong! Why are they harassing her? She's here to help!" His words were met with murmurs of agreement as others began to join in, some stepping forward, others filming the moment for their own social media platforms. The collective energy in the air was palpable, a powerful shift in the atmosphere that gave Michelle strength. She wasn't alone anymore. From the edge of the crowd, Brianna had been watching the scene unfold, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand as she texted her friends. But as the voices of support grew louder, something inside her clicked. She couldn't just stand there and watch. Michelle wasn't just a mentor to her, she was a role model, someone who had taught Brianna the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Now, it was her turn to put those lessons into practice. With newfound courage, Brianna stepped out from the shadows, her small frame moving toward the crowd and toward Michelle. "They're right," she called out, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength with each word. "This is wrong. She's not doing anything wrong." The officers, who had been momentarily thrown off by Michelle's composure, now looked increasingly uncomfortable. The support in the crowd was undeniable, and Brianna's voice seemed to underscore the growing tension. Other bystanders began to add their voices, echoing Brianna's sentiment, calling for an end to the harassment. Michelle turned to look at Brianna, her expression softening with pride. In that moment, the young girl's courage was the kind of support Michelle had always hoped for, not just in the act of standing up for justice, but in the very realization that standing up together made the fight stronger. It was the power of community, the power of solidarity. As the voices in the crowd grew louder, Michelle stood tall, her posture unwavering despite the mounting tension. The officers, now surrounded by growing numbers of witnesses, seemed increasingly on edge. Their faces had gone from confident to unsure, and as their gaze shifted between Michelle and the people speaking up, the dynamic had clearly shifted. Their aggressive stance was faltering, but they weren't ready to back down just yet. Michelle's mind raced, but she knew it was time. Time to end the uncertainty, to take back control of the narrative. Slowly, she reached into her bag, her movements deliberate, knowing that this small but crucial action would change everything. With a calmness that seemed to still the air around her, she pulled out her driver's license and ID badge, holding them up for the officers to see. "I'm Michelle Obama," she said simply, her voice firm but measured. There was no need to shout, no need to react with anger. Her presence, her words, spoke volumes in the quiet that followed. The officers blinked, their expressions shifting in real time from skepticism to shock. For a moment, they stood frozen, as though processing the reality of the situation. The bystander, who had been recording all along, zoomed in as Michelle held up her ID, capturing the stark contrast between their earlier hostility and the realization of their mistake. The footage was undeniable. One officer looked down at the ID in disbelief, his jaw tightening as he realized the magnitude of his misjudgment. The other officer's hand dropped from his radio, now fully aware that their actions had just been exposed, not just to the people standing around them, but to the thousands who would soon see this moment online. A ripple of realization seemed to pass through the crowd. It wasn't just that Michelle Obama was standing there asserting her right to be in that neighborhood. It was that they had targeted a woman who had been a symbol of grace, power, and respect, both in the country and across the world. The situation had gone from an uncomfortable questioning to a full-blown public embarrassment for the officers. As the video continued to roll, capturing the officers' shifting expressions, Michelle could feel the weight of the moment. She had held her ground, remained calm, and now the world was going to see the truth of what had just happened. The officers' previous aggression was now visible for all to see. There was no hiding behind their excuses anymore. As the live stream video continued to circulate, its impact grew with every passing minute. What had started as an isolated moment on a quiet suburban street was quickly becoming a global spectacle. People from all corners of the world were tuning in, commenting, sharing, and debating what they had just witnessed. The tension that had simmered between Michelle Obama and the officers was now being viewed in real time by thousands, then millions, as the footage spread like wildfire. News outlets began to pick up the story, broadcasting the footage of Michelle's confrontation with the police. Headlines flashed across screens, questioning the actions of the officers, questioning the racial bias that seemed to seep through their interactions with her. The story was no longer just about one woman standing up for herself. It had transformed into a conversation about systemic racism, racial profiling, and the double standard that black people faced every day. On social media, the hashtags started to pour in: justice for Michelle, racial profiling, end police bias. People of all backgrounds, races, and walks of life voiced their opinions, some in full support of Michelle's courage, others in disbelief at the officers' actions. But the conversation wasn't limited to just those who agreed with her. There were voices of dissent too, those who tried to defend the officers, arguing that they were simply doing their jobs. But even they couldn't deny the overwhelming evidence that this was an abuse of power, an abuse rooted in assumptions based on race. As the footage spread, more bystanders showed up at the scene, drawn by the viral video. The crowd had grown, substantially, now a mix of concerned residents, community leaders, and people who had heard about the incident online. Some were actively showing support for Michelle, while others stood in silent solidarity, their phones raised to capture the unfolding moment. The officers, once so confident in their authority, now appeared trapped in a public spectacle they could no longer control. Their attempts to justify their actions were weak, almost laughable in the face of the overwhelming evidence. They stammered, stumbling over their words, as the live stream and the growing crowd painted a clear picture. The officers' words, once authoritative, now sounded hollow. They had failed to realize that in this moment they weren't just dealing with Michelle Obama. They were facing an undeniable reckoning. The world was watching, and the narrative was being rewritten before their very eyes. The tension that had been building reached its peak. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore, it was a national moment, one that would echo through conversations about race and power long after the video ended. The crowd knew it, the officers knew it, and Michelle knew it. The shift had happened. Do you think revealing her identity changed the officers' behavior? Should it have mattered? What does this say about systemic issues in society? The fallout from the viral video was swift and undeniable. Within hours of the footage spreading across social media, the national conversation about racial profiling, police brutality, and systemic prejudice reached a fever pitch. News outlets, public figures, and everyday citizens were weighing in, sharing their thoughts, frustrations, and calls for justice. The image of Michelle Obama standing tall, unwavering in the face of injustice, had become a symbol, one of strength, resilience, and the urgent need for change. The police department, facing mounting pressure from both the public and advocacy groups, issued a public statement the following day. The statement was a rare admission of failure, acknowledging that the officers involved had mishandled the situation and had, in fact, subjected Michelle to unjustified harassment. The apology, though necessary, felt somewhat hollow, as the words alone couldn't undo the damage done. Still, it was a small victory in a system that too often failed to hold its own accountable. The officers were placed under internal investigation, their actions now under the microscope of both their superiors and the watching public. Michelle, as expected, responded with grace. She made a statement acknowledging the apology, but she didn't allow it to overshadow the larger issue at hand. "This isn't just about me," Michelle said in an interview shortly after the statement was released. "This is about every single black person who has ever been stopped, questioned, or treated as less than based on the color of their skin. This is about accountability, but also about making sure this never happens again." The video continued to circulate, its impact growing as it sparked conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms alike. As the investigation moved forward, public pressure mounted for the implementation of systemic changes within law enforcement. There were calls for mandatory bias training, increased accountability for officers' actions, and more rigorous oversight of policing practices. The narrative around policing was shifting, one conversation at a time, as the nation grappled with the deep, ingrained issues that had long been ignored. Though Michelle's encounter with the officers had been humiliating and unjust, it had also ignited something powerful. The public outcry was loud, it was forceful, and it was a call to action that could no longer be ignored. The story wasn't over, it was just beginning. In the days that followed, Michelle found herself reflecting on the incident more deeply than she had expected. She had experienced so much in her life, the struggles, the triumphs, the public scrutiny, but this moment had hit differently. The pain and humiliation she had felt in that brief encounter with the officers had stayed with her, a lingering sting that reminded her of the constant, exhausting burden of racism. It wasn't something she could easily shake off, even after. The apology, the investigation, and the public outcry. The memory of standing there, unjustly accused, was something she would carry with her, but she knew she could not let it define her. As she sat quietly one evening, Michelle reflected on the strength she had displayed in that moment, the calm in her voice, the poise in her posture. Those were not just actions born of experience, they were a testament to the years of growth she had undergone. From her childhood on the south side of Chicago to the White House, Michelle had learned that resilience wasn't just about surviving adversity. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice without compromising one's dignity. It was about choosing to be an example for others, especially those who didn't have the platform or the voice to speak for themselves. She thought about the young girls she mentored, how they had been watching her through this entire ordeal. In many ways, she realized, they needed to see her handle this with grace. They needed to see that it was okay to stand up for what was right, even when the world didn't make it easy. Michelle had always believed in teaching them that their voices mattered, that their experiences and their feelings were valid no matter how society chose to dismiss them. Michelle also knew that this moment would serve as a powerful teaching tool for others too, not just for the girls in her program, but for anyone who had ever felt marginalized or silenced. She made a point to address the incident in her next public appearance, her words both reflective and resolute. "This is not just about one incident, and it's certainly not just about me," she said in a speech to a crowd. "This is about understanding that we all have the power to speak up when something isn't right. We all have the power to demand justice, not just for ourselves, but for each other." As she finished speaking, Michelle felt a deep sense of peace. The incident had tested her, but it had also strengthened her resolve. In that moment, Michelle realized that the true strength wasn't in the confrontation itself, but in the lessons it provided. The national conversation that began in the wake of Michelle's encounter with the officers grew louder and more urgent. What had once been a singular, isolated event had transformed into a catalyst for widespread societal change. The video that captured the injustice was not just a reminder of what had happened to Michelle, it became a symbol of the larger systemic issues that plagued communities of color across the country. People, both in positions of power and in everyday life, began to acknowledge that this was not just a moment to be mourned, but a movement to be fought for. The pressure from the public, amplified by social media and the continued conversation across news platforms, forced law enforcement agencies to confront the uncomfortable truth about racial bias within their ranks. The police department involved in the incident was one of the first to publicly address the incident, but it quickly became apparent that the apology alone wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to simply say, "We were wrong." Real change would require tangible action, and it was clear that the system needed reform. In response to the growing calls for accountability, several law enforcement agencies across the country began to introduce new, comprehensive training programs. These programs were designed to address the core issues of racial profiling, implicit bias, and community engagement. Officers were required to undergo training that not only focused on understanding their own biases, but also on learning how to engage with marginalized communities in a way that fostered trust and respect rather than fear and suspicion. The new programs included workshops on the history of racial discrimination, from slavery to segregation to the present-day experiences of Black communities. Officers were taught to recognize and address their biases before they could act on them. These programs emphasized accountability at every level, making it clear that officers would no longer be allowed to justify harmful behavior with the excuse of doing their job. The public had made it clear these patterns of behavior would no longer be tolerated. In addition to mandatory training, new policies were enacted to ensure greater transparency within law enforcement. Officers now had to wear body cameras during all interactions with the public, and those cameras were required to be turned on at the start of any encounter. This measure, though simple, became one of the most effective ways to ensure that citizens' rights were protected and officers' actions were scrutinized. The body camera footage would serve as an undeniable record of events, preventing unjust behavior from going unnoticed or ignored. As these changes began to take shape, the conversation about police reform spread to local governments and legislatures. Lawmakers, prompted by the nationwide outcry, introduced new bills aimed at creating more accountability in policing. The bills included provisions for independent oversight of police departments, greater accountability for misconduct, and the establishment of citizen review boards that could oversee complaints against officers. These efforts represented a major shift in the way law enforcement was expected to function, moving toward a more community-centered approach that prioritized the safety and dignity of all individuals. Michelle, for her part, continued to use her platform to advocate for these reforms. In speeches, interviews, and social media posts, she spoke passionately about the importance of systemic change, not just in law enforcement, but across society as a whole. She knew that one police department's apology would not erase the decades of discrimination and inequality that had shaped the criminal justice system. But she also knew that the growing momentum behind the push for change was a powerful force. She had seen it in the faces of the people who had stood up in support of her during that moment of injustice. She had seen it in the way the nation responded to the story. As Michelle continued her advocacy work, she realized that this was just the beginning. While the policies that began to take shape were vital, they were not the end of the struggle. They were a first step toward a larger transformation, one where racism was not merely acknowledged, but actively dismantled. She knew that the real Work would require sustained effort, compassion, and a collective commitment to the hard truths of this country's past and present. Michelle took solace in the progress that had been made, but she also knew the road ahead would be long. Still, the ripple effects of that one incident, the strength, the solidarity, the conversation, had sparked something larger than herself. It had sparked a movement, one that would not easily be forgotten. The weeks that followed the viral video were filled with a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and public appearances for Michelle. Despite the public support, despite the reforms beginning to take shape, Michelle felt it was important to return to where it all began, to the young girls she had set out to mentor on that day. She knew they needed to hear her words more than anyone. They needed to understand the true power of resilience, of standing firm in the face of injustice, and the importance of using their voices to foster real change. Michelle stood before her group of mentees, the same young girls who had watched the events unfold from the sidelines. She saw the uncertainty in their eyes, the same uncertainty that she had once carried in her own heart when faced with the harsh realities of racism. But she also saw something else. Hope. Hope that change was possible. Hope that their voices could matter. And it was that hope Michelle wanted to nurture, to grow into something that could not be easily dismissed. "Girls," she began, her voice warm but strong, "you've seen what's happened in the last few weeks. You've seen what happened to me, but you've also seen what happened afterward. You've seen people stand up, people demand justice, and you've seen change start to happen. But I want you to understand something very important." She paused, making eye contact with each of them, making sure they felt the weight of her words. "This fight is not over, and it never will be. But this," she gestured to the room full of young faces, "this is where it starts. It starts with each of you using your voice. It starts with each of you refusing to stay silent when something isn't right. It doesn't matter how old you are, or where you come from, or who you think you're up against. If you see something wrong, you speak up." Michelle took a deep breath, reflecting for a moment on her own journey. She had been a young girl once too. She had seen the world's bias against her. She had felt the sting of prejudice and inequality, but she had never stopped fighting for her place in it. And now, it was her responsibility to teach the next generation how to fight for their place as well. Every day, we make choices. We can choose to turn away from injustice, or we can choose to face it head-on. I've chosen to face it, and I hope you will too, Michelle continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. But know this, when you choose to stand up, you won't always get a thank you. The road ahead won't always be easy. You will encounter resistance. You may even face hate, but you will also face the strength that comes with knowing you're doing what's right. She paused again, allowing her words to sink in. Her gaze softened as she looked at the young faces before her. "And let me tell you something," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Every time you choose to use your voice, every time you choose to stand up for what's right, you are part of something bigger. You are part of the movement for justice, for equality, for a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." The room was quiet, each girl hanging on to her, every word, understanding the gravity of what she was saying. Michelle had been where they were. She knew the uncertainty, the fear of speaking out, but she also knew the power that came with those words, the power of speaking truth to power and the weight of changing a system that had long ignored the voices of marginalized communities. "You all have the power to make change," Michelle finished. "And that's something no one can take from you." As she wrapped up her speech, Michelle felt a quiet sense of hope settle within her. She had seen firsthand how powerful solidarity could be, how public outcry could demand action. But now, she was seeing the next generation ready to take the mantle, ready to fight for their place in a society that often overlooked them. That was where the true power lay. The ability to inspire others to keep going, to use their voices, to demand change, and to create a world that was better than the one they inherited. She ended with a message that would stay with her mentees long after she left the room. Remember, it's not just about fighting for your own justice. It's about fighting for the justice of those who cannot speak for themselves, fighting for the world you want to live in. Do you believe this story could inspire real change? How can we ensure incidents like this don't happen again? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Together, we can raise awareness and work toward a better future.